Imagine this. You are a young Spanish woman named Isabella, standing in a shadowy doorway of the royal palace of Madrid in the year 1825. Your hands tremble as you clutch a letter from your brother, a liberal writer who disappeared 3 months ago. The cold marble floor beneath your bare feet seems to pulse with the whispered screams of prisoners echoing from the dungeons below. Through the heavy oak doors, you can hear the shuffling of feet and the mechanical salute of a man who treats human lives like flies to be brushed away. Your breath catches as those doors creak open. The king emerges, a grotesque figure whose very presence seems to corrupt the air around him. His face, painted with cosmetics in the manner of the old Bourbon court, cannot hide the cruelty that has earned him the title El Rey Felon, the criminal king. But what you cannot see, what no portrait dares to reveal, is the anatomical monstrosity that swings between his legs, a deformity so extreme that it would define not just his personal torment, but the political destiny of Spain itself. What you are about to witness in this throne room will make your stomach turn. But what you don't know is that this man's grotesque physical condition and psychological depravity have already determined the fate of an entire empire. His reign of terror has just begun, and before it ends, his anatomical curse will trigger civil wars that will tear Spain apart for generations. The nightmare you're living through isn't just personal. It's the systematic destruction of human dignity by a monster who should never have been allowed near power. But the twisted irony is that without his physical deformity, none of this horror would have been possible. Think medieval tyrants were bad? Think modern dictators represent the height of human cruelty? The man standing before you in that silk-lined chamber makes them look like amateur sadists playing dress-up. This is the story of Ferdinand VII of Spain, a king whose anatomical abnormality created a cascade of political disasters that would haunt Europe for over a century. Before we dive deeper into these buried histories of power and perversion, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history that textbooks never mention, consider hitting that subscribe button. These dark secrets of the past deserve to be exposed, and there are so many more shocking stories waiting to be told. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's most disturbing corners. But first, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. In the corrupt, incestuous world of the Spanish Bourbon court, where Ferdinand VII learned that other human beings existed solely for his pleasure and pain. Ferdinand VII was born on October 14, 1784, into what appeared to be the pinnacle of European royalty. But beneath the gilded surface of the Spanish court lay a festering rot of corruption, sexual depravity, and family hatred that would mold him into the monster he became. His father, Charles the Ford, was a weak, lazy king who preferred hunting to governing. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, openly flaunted her affair with Manuel Godoy, the man who actually ruled Spain while her husband chased deer through the forests. From his earliest memories, Ferdinand watched his mother's lover humiliate his father daily. The court whispered about Maria Luisa's sexual appetites, her numerous affairs, and her complete domination over the pathetic king. But what truly poisoned Ferdinand's soul was witnessing the complete absence of consequences for such behavior. Power, he learned, meant the ability to degrade others without resistance. The child who would become Spain's most despised king grew up in a palace where manipulation, betrayal, and sexual domination were the currencies of power. By age 10, Ferdinand had learned to hate his parents with a cold, calculating fury. By 15, he was plotting against them. By 20, he would commit treason against his own father in an attempt to seize the throne. But here's what historians rarely mention about Ferdinand's development into a monster. His anatomical condition was already becoming apparent. Court physicians whispered about the young prince's unusual development, and palace servants gossiped about the mechanical aids that had to be constructed to accommodate his needs. The physical abnormality that would later require special cushioning devices was already creating a psychological complex that mixed sexual frustration with unlimited political power. The combination was deadly. A young man who felt physically monstrous, raised in an environment where power meant the ability to humiliate others, surrounded by sycophants who encouraged his every cruel impulse. The stage was set for one of history's most devastating reigns of terror. Ferdinand's first taste of real political power came through betrayal and treason. In 1807, frustrated by his exclusion from government and encouraged by his tutor, the 23-year-old prince committed the ultimate act of treachery. He reached out to Napoleon Bonaparte, Spain's greatest enemy, seeking foreign support against his own parents. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was calculated treason that would have consequences for millions of Spanish lives. When Charles IV discovered his son's correspondence with Napoleon, the confrontation was brutal. Guards ransacked Ferdinand's apartments, finding evidence that the heir to the Spanish throne was actively conspiring with foreign powers against his own country. But instead of executing his traitorous son, Charles IV made the fatal mistake of forgiveness. That moment of weakness would cost Spain dearly. Napoleon, recognizing an opportunity to exploit Spanish weakness, invited the entire royal family to Bayonne, France, for negotiations. What happened there reveals Ferdinand's complete absence of honor or patriotism. When Napoleon demanded that both Charles IV and Ferdinand renounce their claims to the Spanish throne, Ferdinand complied immediately. He abandoned his crown, his country, and his people without a moment's hesitation, accepting luxurious imprisonment in the Château de Valençay. While Ferdinand lived in pampered exile, enjoying French cuisine and entertainment, the Spanish people rose in heroic resistance against Napoleon's armies. They fought and died in his name, calling him El Deseado, the Desired One. Peasants who couldn't read or write sacrificed their lives for a king who had sold them to a foreign power without a second thought. The irony is staggering. While Spanish patriots created one of history's greatest resistance movements, fighting brutal guerrilla warfare against French occupation, Ferdinand spent 6 years in comfortable captivity, expressing flattest adulation for the emperor who held him prisoner. He attended Napoleon's court functions, enjoyed French theater, and lived better than 99% of his subjects who were dying for his restoration. But this comfort came at a psychological cost. 6 years of captivity, combined with his already existing anatomical issues, created new layers of resentment and sexual frustration that would explode once he returned to power. The man who had returned to Spain in 1814 was not the same person who had left in 1808. He had become something far more dangerous, a victim who now had the power to create victims of his own. Ferdinand's return to Spain in 1814 should have been a moment of national celebration. Instead, it marked the beginning of systematic oppression that would make his pre-war tyranny look like enlightened governance. The Spanish people expected their desired king to reward their loyalty and sacrifices. Instead, they discovered they had been fighting to restore a monster who viewed their heroism as an inconvenience. The liberals who had created the Constitution of 1812 while fighting Napoleon believed Ferdinand would honor their new freedoms. They had established freedom of the press, abolished the Inquisition, limited royal power, and created the foundation for a modern democratic state. These reforms had been enacted in Ferdinand's name while he was in captivity. Surely, they reasoned, he would embrace the progressive system created by his loyal subjects. They couldn't have been more wrong. On May 4, 1814, Ferdinand issued a decree that would define his character forever. With one signature, he abolished the Constitution of 1812, declared all liberal reforms illegal, and restored absolute monarchy. But that was just the beginning of his revenge against the Spanish people who had dared to govern themselves in his absence. The press, which had flourished during the liberal period, was immediately muzzled. Newspapers were shut down, editors imprisoned, and writers executed. Ferdinand couldn't tolerate the idea that people might express opinions about his governance. The very concept of free speech seemed to personally offend him, as if criticism were a form of sexual assault against his royal person. But Ferdinand's most twisted decision was the restoration of the Spanish Inquisition. This medieval institution of torture and religious persecution had been abolished by the liberals, but Ferdinand brought it back with a vengeance. The man who had collaborated with foreign enemies now positioned himself as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy, using religious authority to justify the systematic torture of anyone who opposed him. The restored Inquisition under Ferdinand VII was different from its medieval predecessor. While earlier inquisitors had focused on religious heresy, Ferdinand's version targeted political dissent. Liberals, intellectuals, and anyone who had supported the Constitution of 1812 found themselves accused of heresy and subjected to torture. The auto da fe, those public spectacles of humiliation and execution, returned to Spanish cities. The most horrifying aspect of Ferdinand's Inquisition was its efficiency. Unlike the chaotic persecutions of earlier centuries, Ferdinand's religious police operated with bureaucratic precision. They maintained detailed records of torture sessions, developed new methods of extracting confessions, and created a climate of terror that penetrated every aspect of Spanish society. But here's what makes Ferdinand's use of the Inquisition particularly grotesque. He didn't believe in its religious mission. Court records show that Ferdinand was personally irreligious, interested only in the Inquisition's power to destroy his enemies. He was using the sacred authority of the Catholic Church as a personal instrument of revenge against people who had tried to create a better Spain in his absence. Ferdinand's personal involvement in torture sessions reveals the sexual component of his cruelty. Witnesses describe how the king would attend interrogations of female prisoners, becoming visibly excited as they were stripped and prepared for torture. His anatomical condition, which required special mechanical aids for normal function, seemed to find satisfaction in the suffering of others. The connection between Ferdinand's physical abnormality and his psychological cruelty cannot be ignored. A man who required mechanical assistance for the most basic human functions found power in reducing others to helpless victims. The torture chamber became a place where Ferdinand could experience dominance in ways his deformed body denied him in other contexts. Foreign observers were horrified by what they witnessed in Ferdinand's Spain. Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, an American naval officer who visited Madrid during this period, left detailed accounts of the oppressive atmosphere. He described a city where people spoke in whispers, where denunciations were common, and where the king moved through his subjects as though he were brushing flies away. Mackenzie's observations reveal Ferdinand's complete disconnection from human empathy. The American officer noted that Ferdinand seemed to view his subjects as objects rather than people, showing no interest in their suffering or welfare. This wasn't mere political authoritarianism, it was pathological indifference to human pain. The economic corruption under Ferdinand was staggering. While maintaining an expensive court and funding the Inquisition's operations, Ferdinand allowed Spain's finances to collapse. The American colonies, which had begun their independence movements during the Napoleonic occupation, were definitively lost during Ferdinand's reign. The wealth that had sustained the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries evaporated, while Ferdinand pursued his personal vendettas. But Ferdinand's most lasting damage was psychological. He created a culture of denunciation where neighbors reported on neighbors, where intellectual curiosity was equated with treason, and where any expression of independent thought could lead to torture and death. This atmosphere of paranoia and repression would poison Spanish society for generations. The personal tragedy behind Ferdinand's political monstrosity becomes clearer when we examine his 4 marriages and the role his anatomical condition played in each relationship. His wives weren't just victims of political marriage, they were casualties of his physical deformity and psychological damage. Ferdinand's first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, married him in 1802 when both were 18 years old. Despite being first cousins, their initial relationship seemed promising. Maria Antonia was intelligent, well-educated, and genuinely tried to make the marriage work. But she had no idea what she was facing on her wedding night. The historical records, preserved in letters to her mother, reveal Maria Antonia's horror at Ferdinand's appearance and behavior. She described him as repulsive, both inside and out, and her wedding night as a traumatic experience that left her physically and emotionally damaged. The anatomical reality that she encountered was so shocking that she never fully recovered from the initial encounter. But it wasn't just Ferdinand's physical condition that horrified Maria Antonia. It was his complete lack of tenderness or consideration. He approached her like a conqueror claiming territory, with no regard for her feelings or comfort. Their intimate relationship became a form of marital rape that modern audiences would recognize as systematic sexual abuse. Maria Antonia's two pregnancies in 1804 and 1805 both ended in miscarriages, likely due to the trauma of Ferdinand's violent approach to intimacy. The court physicians, bound by secrecy, could only hint at the mechanical difficulties that made normal conception nearly impossible. Ferdinand's anatomical condition required special preparations and equipment that turned every intimate encounter into a medical procedure. When Maria Antonia died suddenly at age 21 in 1806, rumors immediately surfaced that she had been poisoned by Ferdinand's mother and her lover Godoy. While never proven, these suspicions reflect the court's understanding that Maria Antonia had become inconvenient to Ferdinand's political ambitions. A wife who openly discussed her husband's sexual inadequacies was a liability that the future king couldn't afford. Ferdinand's second marriage to his niece Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816 followed a similar pattern of trauma and tragedy. Maria Isabel was 19 when she married her 32-year-old uncle, and court records suggest she was better prepared for what she would encounter. But preparation couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of Ferdinand's condition. The couple managed to conceive one child, Maria Luisa Isabel, born in 1817. But the baby died within 5 months, and Maria Isabel's subsequent pregnancy ended in a stillbirth that killed her. The court physicians reported that the difficult birth was complicated by internal injuries consistent with violent sexual trauma. Maria Isabel's death at age 21, the same age as Ferdinand's first wife, established a pattern that would define Ferdinand's relationships with women. He approached them as objects to be used for his pleasure and political needs, with no consideration for their humanity or survival. Ferdinand's third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, faced the additional challenge of extreme religious conviction that made her view any sexual activity as sinful. When Ferdinand entered her chambers naked on their wedding night in 1819, she screamed and ran from the room. Her sister-in-law had to convince her to return, but the psychological damage was done. Historical accounts describe Maria Josefa soiling herself before their first intimate encounter. Such was her terror at Ferdinand's appearance and demands. Even Pope Pius VII had to write her a personal letter explaining that marital intimacy was acceptable to Catholic doctrine. But religious permission couldn't overcome the physical and psychological reality of what Ferdinand required from her. The couple never had children despite 10 years of marriage. Ferdinand's frustration at this failure, combined with his growing political difficulties, created a domestic atmosphere of cruelty and manipulation. Maria Josefa lived in constant fear of her husband's rages, which often included physical violence when his sexual demands were not met to his satisfaction. When Maria Josefa died in 1829 at age 25, again in her 20s like Ferdinand's previous wives, Ferdinand had spent nearly 3 decades traumatizing and ultimately killing the women forced to share his bed. But the death of his third wife created a succession crisis that would finally expose the full scope of Ferdinand's anatomical problem. Ferdinand's fourth and final marriage to his niece Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies in 1829 was purely political. At age 45, Ferdinand was running out of time to produce an heir. His brother Carlos was waiting to inherit the throne, and Carlos represented the ultra-conservative faction that even Ferdinand found extreme. If Ferdinand died childless, Spain would face a succession crisis that could trigger civil war. Maria Cristina was chosen not for her beauty or intelligence, but because she had already proven her fertility in a previous relationship. Ferdinand's ministers had learned from 3 failed marriages that the king's anatomical condition made conception extremely difficult. They needed a woman with a demonstrated ability to carry children to term. The solution to Ferdinand's physical problem came from court physicians who designed what historical records describe as a circular pad that the monarch had to place at the base of the penis to prevent complete penetration. This device, essentially, A medieval cock ring allowed Ferdinand to engage in intercourse without causing fatal injuries to his wife. The mechanical aids required for Ferdinand's sexual function reveal the full scope of his anatomical abnormality. Contemporary accounts describe him as being hung like a horse, but in ways that were considered monstrous rather than impressive. The Greek ideals of physical perfection that still influenced European aesthetics viewed Ferdinand's endowment as a deformity that marked him as bestial rather than virile. With the assistance of these mechanical devices, Ferdinand finally managed to impregnate Maria Christina. Their daughter Isabella was born in 1830, followed by another daughter in 1832. But the conception of these children required medical interventions that turned Ferdinand's marriage bed into something resembling a surgical theater. The birth of Isabella created a new political crisis. Ferdinand had to change Spanish succession law to allow daughters to inherit the throne, bypassing his brother Carlos. This decision would trigger the Carlist Wars, a series of civil conflicts that would devastate Spain for decades after Ferdinand's death. But here's the twisted irony. Without Ferdinand's anatomical deformity, none of this political chaos would have occurred. If he had been physically normal, he would have produced male heirs decades earlier with his first wife. The succession would have been secure, and Spain would have been spared the civil wars that followed his death. Ferdinand's personal monstrosity had created a political catastrophe that would echo through Spanish history for over a century. His inability to function sexually without mechanical aids had determined the fate of an entire empire. The international implications of Ferdinand's reign extended far beyond Spain's borders. While he was busy torturing liberals and restoring medieval institutions, the Spanish-American colonies were declaring independence one by one. Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and other revolutionary leaders took advantage of Spain's weakness to create new nations. Ferdinand's response to these independence movements reveals his complete incompetence as a military leader. Instead of negotiating with colonial elites or offering meaningful reforms, he sent inadequate forces to reconquer territories he had never bothered to understand. The result was a series of military disasters that bankrupted Spain and cost thousands of lives. The loss of the American Empire was directly attributable to Ferdinand's character defects. A more capable leader might have preserved Spanish control through reform or negotiation. But Ferdinand's psychological need to dominate made compromise impossible. He would rather lose everything than share power or acknowledge the legitimate grievances of colonial subjects. By 1825, Spain had lost virtually all of its American possessions except Cuba and Puerto Rico. The wealth that had sustained Spanish power for 3 centuries was gone, sacrificed to Ferdinand's ego and incompetence. Spain went from being Europe's dominant empire to a second-rate power, all because its king was too psychologically damaged to govern effectively. The European powers watched Ferdinand's rule with growing alarm. His restoration of the Inquisition, suppression of liberal reforms, and brutal persecution of political opponents made Spain an international pariah. The Congress of Troppau and later the Congress of Verona discussed Spanish affairs as if the country were a failed state requiring intervention. When Spanish liberals finally rose in revolt in 1820, forcing Ferdinand to restore the Constitution of 1812, European conservatives panicked. The Holy Alliance, led by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, authorized France to intervene militarily to restore Ferdinand's absolute power. The resulting French invasion of 1823 returned Ferdinand to absolute monarchy, but only with foreign bayonets. Ferdinand's dependence on foreign support reveals the bankruptcy of his domestic legitimacy. He could only rule through fear and foreign military assistance. The Spanish people, who had once called him El Deseado, now referred to him as El Rey Felon, the criminal king. His transformation from desired monarch to despised tyrant was complete. The last decade of Ferdinand's reign, from 1823 to 1833, witnessed some of the most extreme repression in European history. With French military support, Ferdinand unleashed a campaign of revenge against everyone who had supported liberal reforms during the Triennial Liberal period. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The restored Inquisition during this period operated with unprecedented brutality. The last execution by the Spanish Inquisition occurred in 1826, when the schoolteacher Cayetano Ripoll was garroted in Valencia for teaching deist principles. This execution caused a European-wide scandal, but Ferdinand remained unmoved by international criticism. Ferdinand's persecution of liberals during the ominous decade created a generation of Spanish exiles who would eventually return to dominate Spanish politics after his death. These men and women had experienced firsthand the cost of Ferdinand's tyranny, and their determination to prevent its return would shape Spanish liberalism for decades. The economic consequences of Ferdinand's misrule became increasingly apparent during his final years. Spain's public debt soared as Ferdinand maintained an expensive court while refusing to implement necessary fiscal reforms. The loss of American revenues, combined with the costs of repression, created a financial crisis that would persist long after Ferdinand's death. But Ferdinand remained indifferent to his country's economic collapse. Court records show him spending enormous sums on personal luxuries while Spanish peasants faced recurring famines and epidemics. His complete disconnection from his subjects' suffering reflects the psychological damage that had shaped his entire approach to kingship. The international isolation of Ferdinand's Spain became complete during his final years. No European power wanted to be associated with his regime's brutality, but they feared the chaos that might follow his death. Spain had become a problem that nobody wanted to solve, but everybody feared to ignore. Ferdinand's death on September 29, 1833, should have brought relief to the Spanish people. Instead, it triggered the succession crisis that his anatomical problems had made inevitable. His brother Carlos refused to recognize Isabella II as queen, claiming that the Salic law prevented female succession. The result was the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict that would devastate Spain for 7 years. The Carlist Wars that followed Ferdinand's death were, in essence, the final consequence of his physical deformity. If Ferdinand had been capable of normal sexual function, he would have produced male heirs decades earlier. The succession would have been clear, and Spain would have avoided the civil wars that consumed the country throughout the 19th century. But Ferdinand's legacy extended beyond dynastic politics. The culture of repression, denunciation, and political violence that he created would poison Spanish society for generations. The deep divisions between liberals and conservatives, between secular and religious authority, between centralists and regionalists, all of these conflicts can be traced back to Ferdinand's reign of terror. Perhaps, most tragically, Ferdinand's rule destroyed Spain's potential for peaceful modernization. The liberal reforms of 1812 had offered a path toward constitutional monarchy and democratic development. Ferdinand's brutal suppression of these reforms set back Spanish political development by decades, condemning the country to a cycle of revolution and reaction that would continue into the 20th century. The personal cost of Ferdinand's reign cannot be calculated. Thousands died in his dungeons, tens of thousands fled into exile, and entire generations grew up in an atmosphere of fear and repression. The human potential that was destroyed, the creativity that was stifled, the progress that was prevented, these losses are immeasurable. But perhaps the most damning aspect of Ferdinand's legacy is how it reveals the dangers of unlimited power in the hands of a psychologically damaged individual. Ferdinand VII was not an evil genius or a strategic tyrant. He was a broken man whose personal pathologies were amplified by absolute authority until they became a national catastrophe. Modern Spain has largely moved beyond the divisions that Ferdinand created, but his reign remains a warning about the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of limiting executive power. The man who required mechanical aids to function sexually managed to rape an entire nation through his abuse of political authority. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most destructive monarchs, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that Ferdinand VII's reign reveals about human nature and political power. His anatomical deformity might have remained a private tragedy, but when combined with unlimited authority and psychological damage, it became a public catastrophe that affected millions of lives. The lesson of Ferdinand VII is not just about the dangers of absolute monarchy or the importance of constitutional limits on power. It's about how personal pathology can be amplified by political authority until individual dysfunction becomes collective tragedy. In our own era of concentrated power and psychological instability among world leaders, Ferdinand's reign offers disturbing parallels and urgent warnings. The 4 women who died young in Ferdinand's marriage beds, the thousands who perished in his dungeons, the millions who suffered under his repression, all were casualties of one man's inability to separate his personal damage from his public duties. Their sacrifice demands that we remember not just the facts of Ferdinand's reign, but the human cost of allowing damaged individuals to wield unlimited power over others. Ferdinand VII died as he had lived, selfishly, cruelly, and without regard for the chaos he was leaving behind. But his death did not end his influence on Spanish history. The civil wars, political instability, and cultural divisions that followed can all be traced back to the reign of the man who was simultaneously too physically inadequate for normal human intimacy and too psychologically damaged for responsible leadership. If this exploration into the darkest corners of royal power has revealed truths that mainstream history prefers to ignore, there are countless more stories waiting to be uncovered. The intersection of personal pathology and political authority has shaped human history in ways that academic historians often refuse to acknowledge. Subscribe to continue this journey through the hidden scandals and buried secrets that determine the fate of nations. And remember, the monsters who rule us are often more twisted than we dare to imagine.